My best friend finally married the woman she loved, but her dad refused to accept it, and what he did next nearly destroyed everything. Leena sat across from me at a quiet corner booth in our favorite coffee shop, the same one we used to sneak off to in high school when everything at home felt too heavy. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her drink, though she hadn't taken a single sip, and I could tell by the way her eyes avoided mine that whatever she was going to say wasn't something light. Finally, she exhaled sharply, then said, "I married her," and in that moment, the full weight of what she meant hit me. I knew she was serious, and I knew this wasn't about impulsivity or drama, but real commitment, a decision made after years of hiding, waiting, planning, and loving someone despite every possible obstacle. I smiled, genuinely happy for her. But underneath that was concern, not because of Jade, who, in truth, was probably the most grounded and emotionally intelligent person Leena had ever been with, but because I already knew the next words she was struggling not to say. My dad don't know. Silence hovered for a few minutes before I asked how she planned to tell him, but she just shook her head, eyes focused on the swirl of foam in her untouched drink, and muttered, "He won't get it, he never has." I didn't push. Because this was more than just coming out, it was about coming into a life her father had spent years trying to shape for her, only for her to finally step out of that mold. I knew Lex, her father, well, hard man, strong opinions, and the kind who believed tolerance was weakness. For all the strength Leena carried, that was the one wall she had never climbed, and in that coffee shop, I sensed she was finally ready to face it, or accept that facing him might end everything. The coming out wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it seem, it was quieter, less shout and more silence, and when Leena finally told her parents over a barely eaten lunch at her family's house, the tension didn't explode. It condensed, like weather shifting before a storm that never quite arrives, and her mother's fingers gripped the napkin too tightly as if trying to contain a response she hadn't practiced, while Lex just sat back in his chair and watched her as if judging the performance of someone who disappointed him on stage, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't even with anger, just a thinned-out kind of disdain as he said he hoped this was a phase and that kids do strange things when they're lonely, ignoring the years Leena had quietly, carefully built with Jade, not because they were secretive, but because they were selective with what they shared, knowing full well how destructive exposure could be, and though Lex didn't curse or yell or forbid anything outright, the message was clear. He wouldn't entertain a reality where his daughter's marriage to a woman was valid, and worse, he saw it as something done in defiance rather than truth, and instead of the open blowout Leena had braced for, she was met with a kind of erasure, no mention of Jade, no questions about how the process had gone, no space to exist in the family as a couple, and as we sat on my porch the next day, Leena confessed something heavier than hurt. It's not that he hates it. It's like he refuses to admit it's even real, and it became clear that dealing with Lex wouldn't be a matter of changing minds but protecting peace against the slow hostility of denial disguised as civility, which we both knew could be just as toxic. The ceremony was minimal, not because they weren't proud, but because Leena had long known that her marriage to Jade would never be celebrated by her family in the same way her siblings' weddings had been. So instead of renting out a venue or sending out invitations, they chose truth over tradition and married quietly at City Hall, with only 2 witnesses, one of them being their neighbor who they'd been kind from the start. And while the day itself brought Leena a smile that ran deeper than either seen in years, there was still an unspoken weight in her silence when I called to congratulate her, as she downplayed the day with comments like, "It's just paper," really, even though I knew it meant everything, because it was hers, but not something she could share with her parents, or even announce to mutual family without calculating fallout, and a few days after the paperwork was filed, her dad Lex accidentally showed up at their residential complex, claiming he was driving nearby and thought to drop off some groceries, yet when Jade opened the door and greeted him, he simply looked over her shoulder and asked if Leena was home, then turned away before Jade could respond, leaving the bag on the floor and walking toward his car without a word, and that moment was not explosive but defining, a kind of subtle erasure, like Eddie decided to cut around the fact that the woman his daughter loved existed at all, and Leena didn't mention the visit afterward unless I asked, brushing it off as Lee's typical posturing, but I could tell it hurt more than she was willing to admit, because this wasn't just rejecting a marriage, it was pretending it never happened, and even for someone as resilient as Leena, that kind of silence sank deep. The pattern didn't take long to solidify. Every holiday, birthday, or family gathering followed the same subtle hostility wrapped in politeness, and while Lex never banned Jade or raised his voice, his approach was far colder, more calculated, like he had drawn a mental box around his version of Leena and refused to acknowledge anything outside of it existed, quietly talking over Jade, ignoring her contributions in conversations, dismissing any shared plans they had, and even going so far as to offer Leena extra help with rent or expenses as long as she didn't move forward with that living arrangement, a coded phrase that was too transparent to be anything but offensive. And while Jade did her best to remain calm and collected during these stunted family moments, Leena's body rarely relaxed, holding on to tension in her shoulders during car rides home and stress laughing when we recapped the interactions, refusing to let Lex know how much it chipped away at their hope for resolution, and I could see how the subtle war began to take its toll, not through outright conflict but through consistent, low-grade rejection that never broke the surface enough to call out directly without being told. "You're just being sensitive," and Leena once told me during a late-night vent session that it wasn't what he said that hurt her most, but what he carefully avoided saying, because that void where love should have been felt louder than insults could be. And I started to urge her to keep some kind of written record of interactions, not because anything criminal was happening, but because I knew that if things escalated, and I had a sense they would, she'd need a smart, factual trail to protect against Liz's tendency to rewrite history and make her out to be irrational when really, she was just reacting to years of controlled silence. Months after the wedding, Lex showed up at their apartment unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and a forced half-smile that made Leena freeze the moment she opened the door because spontaneous apologies didn't in his character, and she called me 15 minutes after he arrived, whispering that something about his tone didn't sit right, so I told her to hit record on her phone and keep it nearby, explaining calmly that documentation didn't mean paranoia, it meant protection, and when I arrived, Lex was seated on the couch speaking in vague moral riddles, saying things like, "I can let this go, for your mother's sake," and, "We all make choices, some you'll grow out of," with passive judgment disguised as reluctant tolerance. And despite his occasional chuckle or self-deprecating lines like, "I'm an old man trying to keep up," it was obvious he wasn't there to connect, he was there to monitor, perhaps even to intimidate subtly, and when Jade entered the room and tried to offer him tea, Lex took the cup but didn't make eye contact, barely acknowledging her offer, turning instead to a family photo on the wall and commenting, "Nice place. Feels temporary though," which felt like a coded signal that he didn't see their life as permanent, and after about 45 minutes, he excused himself, leaving behind a blanket of confusion and calculated discomfort, prompting Leena to finally admit, "I think he came to check how far he could push without losing access," and that's when I emphasized how important it would be moving forward to track not just major events, but these small psychological intrusions, because if there ever came a moment where legal clarity was needed, behavior patterns might matter more than direct threats, and this, in my opinion, looked like the start of something more controlled than emotional. The holidays brought no outbursts but served, instead, as a showcase for Liz's quiet hostility, and during one family dinner where Leena decided to include both Jade and a hand-prepared dish, the situation escalated in subtle yet unmistakable ways, starting when Lex claimed that the eggplant Jade had cooked smelled off and suggested it might be unsafe to eat, despite the fact that the kitchen had been clean, the ingredients fresh, and the aroma pleasant to everyone else, and before anyone could defend the food, Lex stood up and disposed of the entire thing in the garage bin, muttering something about not wanting food poisoning on Christmas, which startled neither Leena nor Jade, who had experienced smaller versions of that behavior before, but this time, it was deliberate, meant to sting, and had his face barely reacted, a silence that was both painful and practiced, while Leena smiled through clenched teeth and redirected conversation as if trying to hold the illusion of family together with frayed thread, and after dinner, she whispered to me on the front porch, is punishing her without ever using the word gay, adding that she didn't know how much longer she could walk on eggshells without letting everything shatter, and I reminded her quietly that every incident needed to be written down as plainly and factually as possible, not in angry tones, but like someone keeping minutes from a meeting, because if this gaslighting turned into something that might one day require legal explanation, a clean record would speak louder than any emotional recounting, and for the first time, Leena nodded not just out of agreement but from fatigue, deciding that moving forward, passive-aggressive family gatherings would no longer go undocumented, especially since Liz's mind games were now disrupting Hadi's mental well-being, and that, above all, was where her line had to be drawn. The decision to install a discreet outdoor surveillance camera wasn't dramatic or based on any single horrifying moment, but rather prompted by a series of accumulating discomforts, like small scratches on Hadi's car, unfamiliar footprints in the garden bed, and the occasional rattle on their locked gate at night, which felt random at first but began to cluster around times when Lex had made contact or shown up near their place by coincidence, and because the measure wasn't invasive or outwardly visible, they figured the low-profile motion camera by the front window would serve less as protection and more as a precaution, and within a few weeks, it captured something that disturbed all of us, not something clearly threatening, but undeniably strange, a figure approaching their porch at 3:17 de la mañana, lingering for 20 seconds with what looked like a canister in hand and then walking out of frame without ringing the bell or attempting entry. And while the low-light and resolution made it impossible to confirm identity or content, Leena froze when she watched the figure's gait and said, without blinking, "That's him," and I paused before responding, knowing instinct wasn't proof, and I gently asked her to save both the footage and a timestamp note, no accusations yet, no conclusions, just archived, documented metadata for now, and though Jade got quiet for most of that morning, she later whispered that it was the not knowing that haunted her most, the blurred edge between paranoia and reality, and the helplessness of seeing something happen without the means to stop it or prove it, and even though the incident passed without escalation, the feeling that someone close to them was pushing boundaries in ways hard to explain lingered heavily, so they started cataloging every vague incident, date, time, action, no interpretation, which soon grew into a digital record they never imagined needing. After reviewing the porch footage and another incident involving a mysteriously opened mailbox filled with soggy paper towels that wasn't enough for police action but just unusual enough to raise alarms, Leena decided to take everything she had to her local precinct and present the growing list of oddities, and although the officer at the intake desk showed concern, the word inconclusive became the default response, as the identity of the person in the night footage couldn't be positively confirmed. No objects were stolen or destroyed, and nothing Lex had done, if it was even him, officially qualified as a crime, to which the officer added, "It's uncomfortable, sure, but not actionable," and Leena left that afternoon angrier than scared, not because people wouldn't believe her, but because they seemed to believe and yet still would do nothing until injury or property damage became visible, and she later told me she felt like reality had turned into a long waiting room with no doctor ever arriving, which disturbed me but didn't surprise me, and we sat down that week to organize her claim folder into 3 detailed sections, one for dates and facts, one for corresponding video or audio, and one for emotional impact statements written calmly and neutrally, even if only for her personal therapy later, and Jade contributed too, writing in simple terms how each incident had shifted her sense of safety at home, especially since Lex, despite technically doing nothing violent, seemed to show up almost like a test balloon, seeing how far he could go while remaining legally invisible, and we agreed that the next step wouldn't be escalation or confrontation but strategy, beginning with reaching out to a legal professional who could advise them on boundary definitions, potential restraining orders, and the legal power of preventative action before something irreversible happened. 3 weeks after the last big incident, another near-miss broke the pattern of passive unease and pushed everything one large step closer to danger when, during a typical Tuesday evening, Jade took out the trash and immediately noticed the extremely pungent smell of gas lingering near the grill in the backyard despite the fact that they hadn't used it in months, and upon cautious inspection, they discovered the propane valve had been twisted open, the igniter cap removed, and one of the garden stones relocated near the side gate, not compelling evidence on its own, but revealed just enough likelihood of manipulation that Jade stepped back in silence, waited until morning, and both she and Leena made a note of it in the logbook, titled it Backyard Gas Leak, November, and included photos just in case the event's blurring lines from discomfort into threat would eventually matter in a report. And perhaps the most unsettling part came later that night when Leena got a call from a block number, brief, no background noise, with only Liz's voice saying, "Smelled anything strange lately?" Before hanging up. It wasn't enough to prove intent or identity, but the timing alone made it damning in context, so they brought all the written logs, call records, photos, and the video from their small surveillance camera facing the rear gate to the same precinct again, only to be reminded that without undeniable proof linking Lex to tampering or trespassing, there were no grounds for legal action, just a general statement logged in their case file to reflect growing concern, which served mostly as paper trail rather than protection, and even though no arrest followed, the call triggered something vital in Leena, who now accepted that this wasn't just resistance or denial anymore, it was active, strategic disregard for her safety, and it required preparation, not confrontation. The following week was filled with quiet dread as Leena and Jade tried to live normally, making tea, answering work emails, and paying bills like any other couple, though every sound near a window after dark made them flinch slightly more and every unusual knock reminded them of the strange voicemail that no one seemed ready to take seriously. So when they filed a second police report citing their latest suspicions, gas sabotage combined with verbal intimidation, the reply from dispatch was sympathetic but familiar. There was still no direct evidence, no law broken clearly enough to warrant arrest, and the officer even said, try to collect more, like it was their job to become surveillance experts just to live in peace. So instead of waiting for help, they focused fully on documentation, printing out photos of shifted objects, notes on odd visit timings, timestamps from phone calls, and even GPS data from phone logs showing Lex had accidentally driven by their street again 2 days prior, and while the law hadn't drawn a line yet, Leena decided she would, internally first, recognizing that they needed to insulate emotionally and protect logistically until someone outside paid attention to the depth of the threat, and that decision brought small changes. They asked the landlord to install a sturdier deadbolt, redirected their mailing address, and even moved valuables into a free storage unit just in case, and it wasn't paranoia, it was a survival strategy being pieced together within a system that reacts only to aftermath, not warnings, and that night after the new lock was installed, they didn't stay home but slept at my place, and though Leena didn't say much as she got ready for bed, she looked different, tired, jazzed, but clear-eyed for the first time in weeks, like she had stopped hoping Lex would wake up one day changed, and had finally accepted that only they could change what came next. After several sleepless weeks and growing frustration with the gap between suspicion and justice, Leena did something that surprised even herself. She retained a licensed private investigator, someone local, well-reviewed, and professional, who kept things ethical, quiet, and methodical, and after their first consultation, he told her plainly that while direct confrontation would backfire, patterns don't lie, and if Lex really was escalating his behavior, it would show through habits, purchases, routes, or slip-ups that could be captured cleanly, so Jade and Leena gave him what they had: photos, recordings, timestamps, phone records, and stepped back while he began quiet observation, which included noting Lee's weekly routines, points of interest, and eventually capturing verified video of him entering a hardware store 3 separate times in 2 weeks, each visit resulting in small item purchases: glass, nylon rope, and gas canisters, items that individually raised no alarm but combined under context sparked concern, especially given the odd visit timings and fact that during one trip he paced a few blocks around their neighborhood before heading home, and the PI advised restraint, emphasized this wasn't enough to act on, but told them calmly and directly, this is someone testing gray areas, he's seeing how far he can go without consequence, and Leena felt both validated and sickened by the confirmation, because even though they long suspected something serious was behind Lee's actions, this was the first third-party validation she received that aligned with her instincts, and it removed any lingering hope that maybe she had misread the tension or overestimated the risk. Instead, it sobered her, pushed her into action she could control, and they scheduled a legal consult to quietly discuss protection orders, not to pull the trigger yet, but to prepare the ground, because it was becoming more clear each week that waiting until after something happened would need. It took more time, paciencia, and restraint than most people would have had, but by the 5th week of ongoing quiet observation, something finally gave in their favor: clear sound footage, not through their camera, but through a directional microphone quietly installed just outside their porch under legal fair use guidelines for property renters. And on a rainy Thursday night at around midnight when they were both away staying at a friend's house for safety reasons, the mic caught a familiar voice whispering near the back window with static interference and pauses, but enough audible clarity to pick up the phrase "still think this is real marriage," followed by footsteps retreating and a distorted laugh, which chilled both Jade and Leena when they reviewed it with the PI, who immediately ran it through enhancement software to clarify tone and background, and though it was not court-quality audio for conviction, it was enough for official concern, especially when tied to the prior hardware store visits and the timeline of escalating contact, and this led to the PI creating a full dossier: dates, surveillance summaries, timestamps, and the enhanced clip, which was then submitted with the assistance of their attorney into a formal police report request to begin non-confrontational legal protection steps, such as a cease and desist warning and the beginning framework for a no-contact order, not to be mistaken for a restraining order yet, but as a formal signal to Lex that records were being kept and consequences were being prepared. And when Leena received the response that the complaint was being transferred to the local prosecutor's administrative vetting team, her first response wasn't joy, it was exhaustion, a calm kind that comes when someone finally understands they've been carrying the burden of proving their own truth for far too long and now might have some institutional eyes watching with them, even if just barely. The moment the cease and desist letter was officially filed and mailed, the dynamic shifted, not publicly, not in social circles or family group chats that largely ignored the tension, but in Lee's behavior, which suddenly flattened, with calls and drive-bys stopping for a full week, creating a silence that felt more threatening than active comment, and just as they hoped maybe it held, a new complication surfaced. A neighbor down the street called Leena one evening to say she had seen a man near their gas meter on the side of the property around 3 de la mañana, not touching anything but standing there long enough to feel worrying, and thanks to the floodlights they recently installed with motion detection, their night camera caught part of it: Lex, wearing gloves, cap low, holding something in one hand while kneeling beside the meter for a few seconds before standing and calmly walking away, and that footage, coupled with the existing timeline, forced the police department to finally take forward motion on it under trespass investigation status, though they still warned that unless it could be proven he had tampered and not just loitered, further consequences would require prosecutorial review. So while there was a history, there was still no arrest, only a formal citation, along with paperwork filed for emergency stay-away restrictions, which granted temporary protection pending further review. And this allowed Leena and Jade to finally sleep a full night without flinching at every thump, even though they knew the stagnancy of the system meant it wasn't over. Not really. But what shook Leena most wasn't that it might happen again, but that there was a chance it wouldn't result in consequences unless someone got hurt, and it was this slow-moving reality that replaced hope with realism, and made her realize that justice in this situation wasn't something she'd ever receive on her terms, but something she'd have to monitor, day by day. The fallout within Leena's family didn't come in one explosive scene. It unfolded as quiet fractures across relationships that had already been fragile for years, and after Lex received the citation and emergency restriction papers, he didn't protest openly or threaten to retaliate, but instead weaponized silence, cutting off contact with Leena entirely, which didn't surprise her nearly as much as what came next: family group messages shortening, phone calls unanswered, sibling birthdays skipped, cousins going cold with vague excuses, and one and even texting Leena privately to say, "You know your father's heart is broken, right?" as if her safety precautions were the cause of the pain, not the years of covert hostility that led to them. And suddenly Leena was left navigating a social divide she hadn't chosen, where some family silently supported her but wouldn't say so aloud, others pretended neutrality while clearly resenting the legal path taken, and a few, including one close cousin, blocked her altogether, which left her wondering whether truth had cleaved her family or whether the illusion of peace had been the only thing holding it together all along. And for Jade, the fracture wasn't new. It was just confirmation of what she'd long predicted, and to her credit, she didn't pressure Leena to react or cut people off out of frustration, but instead reminded her to focus on what could be protected: their home, their peace, their future, even if it meant distancing from people who had chosen silence over principle. And so Leena quietly drafted a boundary email, not emotional, not reactive, just honest, and sent it to her extended family, explaining what had happened, what steps had been taken, and that she was available to anyone willing to engage respectfully. And then she turned off notifications, not expecting closure but finally letting go of needing it from people who only believed in family when it played by their rules. Months passed, and life slowly settled, not into what Leena or Jade would call normal, but into something manageable, peaceful, and grounded in clarity rather than performance. And after moving apartments to a more private unit in a safer neighborhood with community security and tighter access, they both agreed not to start over but to start better, keeping all documentation stored digitally and legally, locked away in a backup drive and attorney folder they hoped they'd never need again. And while Lex never contacted them directly again, occasional updates filtered through, mostly from distant relatives reporting that it is slowed down or wasn't the same since everything happened, which Leena received each time with a stillness that wasn't angry or vindicated. It was just indifferent, which is what healing eventually shaped itself into, not forgiveness under pressure, but release from responsibility for someone who they refused to see her fully for who she was. And one day while walking their dog along the new trail near their building, Jade gently asked Leena whether she had any curiosity about reconnecting with her father someday if time softened him, and Leena stopped walking for a moment, thought carefully, and said, "I don't need to," not out of hatred, but out of a self-respect that had taken years to build, because closure wasn't something Lex could grant, it was something Leena had to construct herself, quietly, steadily, and without expecting apologies that would likely never come. And though the legal case never became dramatic and Lex was never convicted or jailed, the paper trail, the protective perimeter, and their disciplined restraint had done something rarer. They had kept them safe, mentally intact, and not consumed by the need for revenge. And as we all sat together one evening months later, sharing dinner like regular people in a space they called truly theirs, I realized the end of their story wasn't about punishment, it was about peace, stability,